high above the blazing blue waters of the Pacific Ocean. A sound cut through the tropical air that would soon become the nightmare of every Japanese pilot who heard it. It was the distinctive twin-engine roar of a machine that looked like nothing else in the sky, a strange fork-tailed devil that split the clouds with two long booms and a central pod where the pilot sat between them. The Japanese called it many names, but the one that stuck was the most honest: the two planes, one fighter. When American pilots first climbed into the cockpit of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, they knew they were sitting in something special, something deadly, something that would change the balance of power in the Pacific theater forever. But the story of how this magnificent warbird went from being mocked and dismissed by confident Japanese aviators to becoming their most feared opponent is a tale of engineering brilliance, tactical evolution, desperate combat, and the transformation of aerial warfare itself. This is not just the story of a plane. This is the story of how respect is earned in blood and thunder at 20,000 feet, where mistakes cost lives and superiority must be proven every single day in the unforgiving arena of the sky. When the Lockheed P-38 Lightning first appeared in the skies over the Pacific in 1942, it looked like something from a science fiction magazine rather than a military airfield. Most fighter planes of World War II had a simple design with one engine in the front, a cockpit behind it, and a tail in the back. But the Lightning broke every rule that pilots thought they understood about what made a good fighter. The plane had two engines mounted in long booms that stretched backward from the wings, and between these booms sat a short central nacelle where the pilot controlled this beast, giving him an incredible view in almost every direction. The twin-boom design meant the tail was split into two vertical stabilizers with a horizontal stabilizer connecting them, creating that distinctive fork-tailed silhouette that would become instantly recognizable across every battlefield where it appeared. The plane was big for a fighter, much bigger than the nimble Japanese Zero or the compact American Wildcat, and many pilots who first saw it sitting on the runway thought it looked clumsy and strange. The P-38 stretched over 37 feet long and had a wingspan of 52 feet, making it seem more like a light bomber than a dogfighter. But what those first impressions missed was the raw power hidden inside those twin booms, where two Allison V1710 engines pumped out over 1,000 horsepower each, giving the Lightning a combined punch that could drive it through the sky at speeds that left enemy pilots staring in disbelief at their instrument panels. The designers at Lockheed had created the P-38 in response to a 1937 Army Air Corps specification that called for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, which seemed almost impossible at the time. Lead designer Clarence Kelly Johnson, who would later become a legend in aviation history, chose the twin-engine layout because single engines of that era simply could not produce enough power to meet the performance requirements while also carrying heavy armament and sufficient fuel for long-range missions. The decision to put the cockpit in a central nacelle between the engines gave the pilot exceptional visibility and also allowed all the plane's weapons to be mounted in the nose, firing straight ahead with no propeller in the way to limit their placement. This meant the P-38 could pack an incredible punch with 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon all concentrated in the nose, creating a devastating cone of fire that did not spread out like wing-mounted guns did on other fighters. When those guns fired together, they poured out a stream of bullets and explosive shells that could saw through enemy aircraft like a chainsaw through wood. But all this firepower and those powerful engines came with a price, because the P-38 was complicated to build, expensive to maintain, and challenging to fly, especially for inexperienced pilots who had trained on simpler single-engine fighters. When the P-38 Lightning began arriving in the Pacific theater in late 1942, the tactical situation was desperate for American forces who had been fighting a defensive war against a Japanese military machine that seemed unstoppable. Japanese pilots flew the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, a lightweight fighter that could outturn almost anything in the sky, and had scored victory after victory against Allied aircraft throughout 1941 and 1942. The Zero pilots were experienced, highly trained, and supremely confident in their abilities and their aircraft, having dominated the skies over China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands with apparent ease. These Japanese aviators had developed tactics specifically designed for the Zero's strengths, which included incredible maneuverability, long range, and the ability to climb quickly to high altitudes where they could dive on their enemies from above. When intelligence reports reached Japanese squadrons that the Americans were bringing in a new twin-engine fighter, many pilots actually laughed at the news because they assumed any twin-engine aircraft would be slow, clumsy, and easy prey for their agile Zeros. The conventional wisdom among Japanese fighter pilots was that dogfighting was all about tight turns and quick maneuvers, and how could a big, heavy American plane with two engines possibly compete in that kind of aerial ballet, where the Zero was the undisputed master? The first encounters between P-38s and Japanese fighters seemed to confirm these assumptions, at least from the Japanese perspective. Because the American pilots were still learning how to fly their complex new mounts and had not yet developed the tactics that would make the Lightning truly deadly, early P-38 pilots tried to dogfight with Zeros using traditional turning battles, which played directly into the Japanese fighters' greatest strength, and the results were often disappointing or even disastrous for the Americans. The Zero could turn inside the P-38 with ease, and in a slow-speed turning fight, the Japanese plane would simply circle around and get on the Lightning's tail, forcing the American pilot to either take hits or dive away to escape. Japanese pilots who survived these early encounters returned to their bases, with stories about the strange fork-tailed American fighter that was big and fast but could not turn worth a damn. And these stories reinforced the belief that the P-38 was just another inferior American design that would fall before the superior skill and equipment of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces. Some Japanese pilots even started referring to P-38 encounters as easy victories, another American plane to add to their growing lists of kills, and the confidence in Japanese ready rooms remained sky-high even as more and more Lightnings arrived at American bases across the Pacific. But something was shifting in those tropical skies that the Japanese pilots had not yet recognized, a fundamental change in tactics and understanding that would turn the P-38 from a questionable experimental fighter into an apex predator that ruled the high-altitude battle space. American pilots and their commanders began studying their combat reports and realized that trying to outturn the Zero was a losing game that played to the enemy's strengths rather than exploiting the Lightning's incredible advantages. The P-38 could not win a turning fight against a Zero, but it did not need to because it had speed, lots of speed, more speed than any Japanese fighter could match. And it also had power and altitude performance that allowed it to climb high and dive fast while maintaining control. The breakthrough came when experienced pilots started sharing a new tactical doctrine that would become known as boom and zoom, a method of fighting that used the P-38's superior speed and climb rate to attack from above, fire a devastating burst, and then zoom back up to altitude before the enemy could react. This tactical revolution meant that P-38 pilots would no longer chase Japanese fighters into low-altitude turning battles where the Zero had the advantage. Instead, Lightning pilots would climb high above the battlefield, spot their targets below, and then dive at tremendous speed to make a high-speed firing pass before pulling up and climbing away faster than the Japanese planes could follow. The beauty of boom and zoom tactics was that they completely negated the Zero's turning ability, because the combat was over before the turning fight could even begin. A P-38 diving from 25,000 feet could build up speed approaching 500 miles per hour, screaming down on an unsuspecting Japanese formation, with such velocity that the enemy pilots barely had time to register the attack before cannon shells and machine gun bullets were ripping through their wings and fuselages. The Lightning's concentrated nose armament meant that the American pilot only needed to point the plane at his target and fire, with all 5 weapons converging on a single point rather than spreading out like wing-mounted guns. When that cone of fire hit a lightly built Japanese fighter, the results were catastrophic, with wings tearing off, fuel tanks exploding, and aircraft disintegrating in midair under the hammer blow of American firepower. After delivering this devastating attack, the P-38 pilot would use his plane's superior speed and power to zoom back up to altitude, climbing away faster than the Zeros could follow, getting back above the enemy formation, ready to make another diving attack. The Japanese pilots would turn desperately trying to get their sights on the American plane, but the Lightning was already gone, already climbing, already preparing to come back down like a falcon striking a flock of sparrows. As more American pilots adopted these boom and zoom tactics, the balance of power in the Pacific skies began to shift in ways that shocked and frightened the once confident Japanese aviators. Suddenly, the war was no longer being fought on terms that favored the Zero's maneuverability, but instead on terms that showcased the P-38's overwhelming advantages in speed, firepower, and altitude performance. Japanese formations that had once moved freely across the Pacific theater now had to constantly scan the sky above them. Watching for the telltale glint of sunlight on twin booms that meant death was diving toward them at incredible speed. The psychological impact of this tactical shift cannot be overstated, because the Japanese pilots went from being the hunters to being the hunted, from feeling confident and superior to feeling vulnerable and exposed every time they took to the air. The P-38 became known among Japanese aircrews as a plane that you could not catch when it did not want to fight, and could not escape when it decided to attack, a combination that created a sense of helplessness and dread that eroded morale across Japanese air units throughout the Pacific. One of the most significant advantages the P-38 brought to the Pacific War was its incredible range, which allowed it to escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory and operate over vast expanses of ocean where single-engine fighters simply could not go. The twin engines and large fuel capacity meant that Lightnings could fly missions lasting 6, 7, or even 8 hours, providing protection for bomber formations all the way to the target and all the way back home. This extended range capability transformed the strategic situation, because Japanese bases and installations that had once been safe from American bombers, due to the lack of fighter escort, were suddenly vulnerable to attack, with P-38s flying top cover and shooting down any Japanese interceptors that tried to break up the bomber formations. Japanese commanders found themselves unable to defend their far-flung bases adequately, because the Lightning could appear anywhere, stay for hours, and depart before reinforcements could arrive, creating a mobility and flexibility that the range-limited Japanese fighters simply could not match. The fork-tailed devils, as the Japanese increasingly called them, seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing out of nowhere to shred bomber formations, strafe airfields, and shoot down reconnaissance planes and transports that had previously operated with relative safety. The title of this story speaks to one of the most terrifying aspects of facing a P-38 in combat. Once it decided to chase you, there was almost no escape unless you were very lucky or the American pilot made a serious mistake. Japanese pilots who found themselves being pursued by a Lightning quickly discovered that their usual escape tactics simply did not work against this particular opponent. If you dove away from a P-38, it would follow you down and actually get faster in the dive, closing the distance rather than falling behind like most fighters did. If you tried to climb away, the Lightning's powerful twin engines would carry it upward faster than your Zero or Oscar or Tony could manage, and the American pilot would keep gaining on you meter by meter until he was in firing range. If you tried to turn and force an overshoot, The P-38 pilot who knew his business would simply throttle back slightly, stay behind you, and wait for you to run out of airspeed before delivering a killing burst. The only real escape was to get into clouds or somehow make it back to your own airfield, where friendly anti-aircraft guns might discourage the pursuer. But even then, many P-38 pilots were aggressive enough to follow their targets right down to the deck and finish them off before they could land. This relentless pursuit capability came from the fundamental performance advantages built into the Lightning's design, advantages that became more pronounced as Lockheed continually improved the aircraft throughout the war. Later model P-38s had more powerful engines, better superchargers for high-altitude performance, improved dive brakes to help control speed in steep dives, and countless small refinements that made the plane faster, more reliable, and more deadly with each new variant. The P-38J and P-38L models that appeared in 1943 and 1944 were significantly superior to the early P-38E and P-38F models that had first entered combat, with top speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour and the ability to cruise at high altitude for hours, while still maintaining the power to accelerate quickly when combat developed. Japanese aircraft designers tried to develop fighters that could compete with the Lightning's performance, producing planes like the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony and the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank that had better speed and armament than the Zero. But even these improved Japanese fighters found themselves outmatched by the P-38's combination of speed, firepower, altitude performance, and above all, the tactical advantages that came from having two engines and the ability to fight on terms that the American pilot could control. The P-38 Lightning produced more American aces than any other aircraft type in the Pacific theater, with legendary pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles MacDonald racking up incredible scores against Japanese aircraft while flying the fork-tailed fighter. Major Richard Bong became America's top ace with 40 confirmed victories, all of them achieved while flying the P-38, and his success demonstrated what a skilled pilot could accomplish when he fully understood and exploited the Lightning's capabilities. Bong was not a flashy pilot who took unnecessary risks or tried to dogfight on the enemy's terms. Instead, he was a methodical hunter who used altitude, speed, and patience to position himself for high-percentage shots, diving on distracted enemy aircraft, firing a precise burst, and then climbing away to set up his next attack. His approach to air combat embodied the boom and zoom tactics that made the P-38 so effective, and his incredible success inspired and instructed an entire generation of American fighter pilots who learned that discipline and tactical intelligence were more important than raw flying skill or daredevil courage. Major Thomas Maguire, who scored 38 victories before his death in combat, was another P-38 ace whose career illustrated both the Lightning's potential and the dangers of forgetting the lessons that made it successful. Maguire was aggressive and driven, constantly seeking combat and pushing himself and his aircraft to the absolute limit in pursuit of enemy planes. His tactics were sound, and his shooting was excellent. But in January 1945, he violated one of the cardinal rules of P-38 combat when he attempted a low-altitude turning fight with a Japanese fighter while flying an aircraft that was carrying external fuel tanks that should have been dropped before entering combat. The added weight and drag from the tanks reduced his plane's performance at the worst possible moment, and Maguire's P-38 stalled and crashed during the low-level maneuvering, killing him instantly. His death was a sobering reminder that even in a superior aircraft like the Lightning, tactical mistakes could be fatal, and that the P-38's advantages only helped pilots who remembered to use them properly. The Japanese pilot who had been dueling with Maguire undoubtedly felt a moment of triumph, but that single victory could not change the reality that P-38s had by that point in the war achieved complete aerial superiority over Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. As the war progressed through 1943 and 1944, Japanese pilots developed an almost superstitious dread of the P-38 Lightning that went beyond simple respect for an effective enemy weapon. Stories circulated through Japanese air units about the fork-tailed devil that could not be shaken, could not be outrun, and would chase you across miles of ocean until its deadly nose guns finally found their mark. Some Japanese pilots claimed that the P-38 was so fast that, by the time you saw it, you were already dead, while others spoke of American pilots who seemed to have supernatural ability to appear from nowhere, strike like lightning, and vanish back into the sky before you could even radio a warning. These stories were not entirely exaggeration or myth, because the P-38's performance really did give it a quality of seeming to be everywhere at once, able to engage when it wanted to and disengage when it did not, controlling the tempo and terms of every battle. Japanese aircrew survival rates plummeted as the war continued, with newer and less experienced pilots being thrown into combat against veteran American P-38 units that had years of combat experience and aircraft that were continually being improved and upgraded. The psychological warfare aspect of the P-38's reputation became almost as important as its actual combat performance because Japanese pilots who were already frightened of the Lightning would make mistakes, would break formation too early, would abandon their attack runs on American bombers to defend against P-38s that might not even be there yet. This fear-induced degradation of Japanese combat effectiveness multiplied the Lightning's impact far beyond what its actual numbers would suggest, because a single formation of P-38s could disrupt an entire Japanese air operation simply by appearing on the scene, forcing the enemy to react defensively rather than carrying out their planned mission. American commanders recognized this psychological advantage and exploited it ruthlessly, using P-38s as both a sword to strike Japanese formations and a shield to protect American bombers and reconnaissance aircraft from enemy interceptors. The Lightning became the backbone of American fighter operations across the Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands in the north to New Guinea in the south, from the Solomons in the east to the Philippines in the west, and everywhere it went, it carried its reputation as the plane that Japanese pilots had learned to fear and respect. During the Great American Island Hopping Campaign that pushed across the Pacific toward Japan, the P-38 Lightning played an absolutely critical role in achieving and maintaining air superiority over each contested island and atoll. When American forces prepared to invade a Japanese-held island, P-38s would fly combat air patrol missions over the invasion fleet, protecting the vulnerable transport ships and amphibious landing craft from Japanese air attacks that could turn a successful invasion into a massacre. The Lightning's long range meant it could stay on station for hours, circling high above the fleet and the beaches, watching for incoming enemy aircraft and ready to dive on any Japanese planes that tried to break through to attack the ships or the troops on the ground. Japanese commanders would send wave after wave of bombers and fighters against these invasions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders and sink enough ships to force the Americans to withdraw. But the P-38 formations would tear into these attack formations with devastating efficiency, shooting down bombers before they could drop their payloads and driving off the escort fighters that tried to protect them. The presence of P-38s over an invasion site meant that American troops on the beaches could focus on fighting the Japanese defenders on the ground rather than being constantly bombed and strafed from the air. And this air superiority was absolutely essential to the success of the island hopping strategy. Pilots flying combat air patrol missions might spend 6 or 7 hours in the cockpit maintaining position, watching their instruments, scanning the sky for threats, and dealing with the physical and mental fatigue that came from that kind of extended vigilance. When enemy aircraft finally appeared, These pilots had to instantly transition from patient watching to aggressive combat, diving their planes into attack position and engaging enemies who were themselves often exhausted from long over-water flights to reach the battle area. The combat over places like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa saw P-38s rack up hundreds of victories against Japanese aircraft, with some of the most intense aerial battles of the Pacific War taking place as Japanese forces threw everything they had against the American invasions in desperate attempts to turn back the tide. Perhaps no single P-38 mission better demonstrated the aircraft's capabilities and the fear it inspired in the Japanese than Operation Vengeance, the long-range interception mission that resulted in the death of Admiral Isasoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted and decoded Japanese radio messages, revealing that Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on a specific date and time, giving the Americans a chance to eliminate one of Japan's most important military leaders. The problem was that Bougainville was over 400 miles from the nearest American airbase, a distance that put it beyond the range of most American fighters. But it was right at the limit of what P-38s could accomplish with careful planning and external fuel tanks. A special mission was organized with 18 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron, divided into a killer flight of 4 aircraft that would actually attack Yamamoto's plane, and a cover flight of 14 aircraft that would protect the attackers from Japanese escorts and intercept any reinforcements. The mission required the P-38s to fly a long over-water navigation leg at extremely low altitude to avoid Japanese radar, maintain strict radio silence, time their arrival to intercept Yamamoto's flight exactly when and where the intelligence predicted, and then fight their way out through whatever Japanese defenses they encountered. The pilots flew their Lightnings just 50 feet above the ocean waves for over an hour, navigating by compass and stopwatch, knowing that if they missed their target or if the intelligence was wrong, they would have barely enough fuel to make it back home and would have accomplished nothing. But the intelligence was perfect, and the P-38s arrived at the interception point within 1 minute of the planned time, spotting Yamamoto's 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and their escort of 60 fighters flying at low altitude on their way to Bougainville. The killer flight, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, attacked immediately, diving on the bombers, while the cover flight climbed to intercept the Zeros that were scrambling to defend their commander. What followed was a brief but incredibly intense combat as the P-38s used their superior speed to slash through the Japanese formation, firing devastating bursts into the bombers while dodging return fire from both the Zeros and the bombers' defensive guns. Yamamoto's bomber was hit multiple times, its wing torn off by the concentrated fire from the Lightning's nose guns, and it crashed into the jungle below, killing the admiral and everyone else aboard. The second bomber was also shot down, and while the Japanese Zeros tried desperately to intercept the attacking P-38s, the American planes simply accelerated away, using their speed advantage to outdistance the pursuit, and then climbing back up to altitude for the long flight home. 3 Zeros were shot down in the brief combat, and while 1 P-38 was damaged and had to make an emergency landing, all the American pilots survived the mission. The death of Yamamoto was an enormous blow to Japanese morale and removed one of their most capable strategic leaders. But beyond that tactical victory, the mission proved conclusively that the P-38 could strike anywhere in the Pacific theater, could penetrate deep into Japanese-held territory, could fight its way through enemy defenses, and could return home safely, a combination of capabilities that no other American fighter of that era could match. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, The P-38 continued to evolve and improve as Lockheed incorporated lessons learned from combat operations and addressed the various technical problems that had plagued earlier models. The P-38J variant, introduced in 1943, featured improved engines with better superchargers, hydraulically boosted ailerons that made the plane easier to handle at high speeds, and increased fuel capacity that extended the already impressive range even further. The P-38L, which became the most produced variant with over 3,000 built, added even more improvements, including underwing rocket rails that allowed the Lightning to carry devastating air-to-ground ordnance for ground attack missions. These late-war P-38s were formidable machines that had none of the early technical troubles that had sometimes limited the Lightning's effectiveness, and pilots who flew them spoke of an aircraft that was reliable, powerful, fast, and deadly in equal measure. The Japanese had no answer to these improved Lightnings, and by late 1944, Japanese air power in the Pacific had been so thoroughly defeated that American fighters, including P-38s, could roam almost at will over Japanese-held territory, strafing airfields, attacking shipping, and shooting down the few Japanese planes that still dared to take to the air. The Lightning also proved itself in the ground attack role, where its heavy armament, rugged construction, and twin-engine redundancy made it an effective fighter-bomber that could carry bombs or rockets to attack ground targets and still defend itself against enemy fighters. P-38 struck Japanese airfields, destroyed parked aircraft, bombed supply dumps, strafed truck convoys, and attacked shipping throughout the Pacific Islands, adding another dimension to their contribution to the war effort beyond pure air-to-air combat. Some P-38 units specialized in skip bombing attacks against Japanese shipping, flying in at very low altitude and skipping bombs across the water into the sides of enemy vessels like stones skipping across a pond, a dangerous tactic that required nerve and precision, but could deliver devastating results against supply ships and small warships. The versatility of the Lightning meant that it could be employed in almost any role that required a fighter-sized aircraft, from high-altitude interception to low-level ground attack, from bomber escort to armed reconnaissance, making it one of the most useful and flexible aircraft in the American arsenal. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its final year, and the P-38 Lightning had established such complete dominance over Japanese air forces that the tactical situation bore almost no resemblance to the early days when Japanese pilots had laughed at the strange fork-tailed fighter. Now it was the Japanese who were desperate, throwing together increasingly primitive and ineffective aircraft, while their experienced pilots were dead or grounded by lack of fuel, and their replacements were barely trained teenagers who stood no chance against veteran American units flying superior equipment. P-38s based in the Philippines and on captured Pacific Islands flew escort missions for B-29 superfortresses bombing Japan itself, protecting the huge bombers during their long flights to Japanese cities and shooting down whatever Japanese interceptors managed to get airborne to defend their homeland. The few Japanese pilots who survived encounters with P-38s in late 1944 and early 1945 spoke not of the fork-tailed devil with bravado or dismissal, but with exhausted resignation, knowing that they were facing an opponent they could not defeat but continuing to fly because military discipline and national honor demanded it. The introduction of Japanese kamikaze tactics in late 1944 added a new and nightmarish dimension to the air war, as Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their explosive-laden aircraft into American ships in suicide attacks that could not be deterred by the fear of death. P-38s and other American fighters threw themselves into the desperate effort to stop these kamikaze attacks, intercepting the Japanese suicide planes before they could reach the fleet and shooting them down in enormous numbers. But the kamikazes were difficult to stop completely because they were willing to fly through any amount of defensive fire to reach their targets. Lightning pilots would sometimes have to shoot down 3, 4, or 5 kamikaze aircraft in a single mission, only to watch in horror as one more got through and crashed into a destroyer or carrier, killing dozens or hundreds of American sailors. These missions required a different kind of courage than normal air combat, because the enemy pilots were not trying to escape or even to fight, but simply to sacrifice themselves. And stopping them required absolute aggression and perfect shooting, because anything less meant that the kamikaze would reach his target and American ships would burn. Even as the war drew toward its conclusion in August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's subsequent surrender, P-38 Lightnings remained on combat patrol, protecting American forces and ready to strike any Japanese aircraft or ground targets that appeared. The final combat missions of World War II saw P-38s in the air over Japan and the surrounding ocean, maintaining vigilance until the moment the ceasefire officially began and the shooting war finally ended. When Japanese representatives flew to meet with American officials to arrange surrender terms, they did so in aircraft that were escorted by American fighters including P-38s, a symbolic demonstration of the complete aerial supremacy that the Allies had achieved. The Lightning had entered the war as an experimental fighter that many people doubted, had proven itself in the most demanding combat environment imaginable, and had finished the war as one of the most respected and feared aircraft in the Pacific theater, with a reputation that would last long after the last P-38 was retired from service. The statistics tell part of the story, with P-38s accounting for thousands of Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat and countless more destroyed on the ground or damaged beyond repair. American pilots who flew the Lightning achieved some of the highest ace scores in the Pacific War, with multiple pilots reaching 20, 30, or even 40 confirmed victories. But beyond the numbers, the real measure of the P-38's impact was the way it changed the balance of power in the Pacific skies from a contested battle space, where both sides could claim victories, to an environment of complete American dominance, where Japanese aircraft became victims and targets rather than threats. The journey from being laughed at by confident Japanese pilots to becoming the nightmare that haunted their every flight was complete, and the transformation had been absolute. The fork-tailed devil had earned its fearsome reputation the hard way, through combat effectiveness and relentless pursuit, through technological superiority and tactical innovation, through the courage and skill of the pilots who flew it and the engineers who kept improving it. When the war ended and peace finally came to the Pacific, the P-38 Lightning quickly faded from frontline service as jet aircraft and new designs replaced the propeller-driven fighters of World War II. But the legend of the Lightning lived on in the memories of the men who had flown it and the men who had faced it, in the history books that recorded its victories, and the museum pieces that preserve its distinctive silhouette for future generations. Japanese veterans who survived the war and later spoke about their experiences would sometimes mention the P-38 with a mixture of respect and remembered fear, acknowledging that it had been one of the most formidable opponents they had faced, and that its appearance in the sky had signaled the beginning of the end for Japanese air power in the Pacific. American veterans who had flown the Lightning spoke of it with affection and pride, remembering it as the aircraft that had given them the tools they needed to win their battles and come home alive, the plane that had been fast enough, powerful enough, and deadly enough to overcome the best the enemy could throw against them. The technical lessons learned from the P-38's design influenced post-war aircraft development, with the concept of twin-engine fighters and the importance of concentrated nose armament becoming standard features in many jet fighters that followed. The tactical lessons of boom and zoom combat, of using speed and altitude as weapons, of refusing to fight on the enemy's terms, and instead forcing combat to occur only when you held the advantage. These lessons became fundamental principles of fighter tactics that are still taught to fighter pilots today. The P-38 Lightning proved that innovation and adaptation could overcome initial skepticism and tactical challenges, that a weapon system dismissed by the enemy could become that enemy's worst nightmare when employed correctly, and that the combination of excellent equipment and skilled operators could achieve dominance even against opponents who started with advantages in experience and numbers. The story of the Lightning in the Pacific is ultimately a story about transformation, about learning and adapting, about taking a machine that was misunderstood and developing it into a war winner that changed history. This journey began with Japanese pilots laughing at the strange American fighter with two engines and a forked tail, confident that their nimble Zeros would make short work of this clumsy-looking intruder into their domain. It ended with those same pilots, the ones who survived, speaking in hushed tones about the fork-tailed devil that ruled the skies, that could not be caught, could not be escaped, and would chase you across miles of ocean until its guns finally tore your aircraft apart. The transformation from mockery to terror, from dismissal to dread, happened over the course of thousands of combat missions and countless individual encounters where P-38 pilots proved again and again that their aircraft was superior when flown according to tactics that exploited its strengths. The laughter died somewhere over the blue waters of the Pacific, replaced by the sound of twin Allison engines roaring at high throttle, the scream of a Lightning diving from altitude at tremendous speed, and the devastating thunder of 4 machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon firing together in a concentrated burst of destruction. The Japanese had learned their lesson but learned it too late to change the outcome of the war, and by the time they truly understood what they were facing, American production lines were turning out hundreds of P-38s every month, while Japanese factories struggled to build any aircraft at all under relentless American bombing. The chase that the title speaks of was not just the tactical chase of one aircraft pursuing another in combat, but the strategic chase of American industrial and technological might pursuing and overtaking an opponent who could not match the pace. Every P-38 that rolled off the Lockheed production line represented not just a weapon but a statement of purpose, a promise to Japanese forces that the Americans were coming, were bringing overwhelming power, and would not stop until victory was complete. The Lightning was the visible symbol of that promise, the aircraft that carried American pilots into battle and brought them home victorious, the machine that transformed the Pacific skies from a battleground to an American-dominated space where the enemy could only survive by hiding or running. Today, more than 3/4 of a century after the last P-38 Lightning flew combat missions in the Pacific, the aircraft remains one of the most recognizable and celebrated fighters of World War II. Aviation museums around the world maintain and display restored Lightnings, keeping their stories alive for new generations who never knew the war, but can still appreciate the engineering brilliance and combat effectiveness of this remarkable aircraft. Air shows occasionally feature flying P-38s, and when those twin engines roar to life, and that distinctive forked tail fighter climbs into the sky, everyone who watches is transported back to an era when these machines ruled the Pacific skies and carried the hopes of a nation into battle. The stories of Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, and the thousands of other P-38 pilots who flew combat missions, are preserved in books and documentaries, ensuring that their courage and sacrifice and skill are not forgotten by the passage of time. The fundamental lesson of the P-38 Lightning story is that respect cannot be demanded or assumed, but must be earned through performance and proven through repeated success under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Japanese pilots laughed at the Lightning when they first heard about it because they assumed their experience and their aircraft would make them superior. But combat has a way of revealing truth that propaganda and wishful thinking cannot hide. When the P-38 proved itself in battle, when it demonstrated that it could outfight, outrun, and outlast the best the Japanese could offer. That laughter turned to silence and then to fear, and the transformation was irreversible. The chase that could go on for miles, the pursuit that seemed never to end, the fork-tailed devil that appeared from above and struck like lightning before climbing away to attack again. These images became the reality that Japanese pilots faced every time they took off from their bases, knowing that somewhere in the sky American P-38s were waiting, watching, and ready to strike. This is the complete story of how a fighter that was doubted, mocked, and dismissed became one of the most feared and respected aircraft of World War II. How tactical innovation turned performance advantages into combat dominance, and how the laughter of confident enemies was replaced by the thunder of American victory, written in contrails across the Pacific sky.